Welcome to SUP, the Super Urban Podcast, a discussion on cities coming from RMIT Architecture and Urban Design in Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. I'm Ian Nazareth.
I'm Graham Christ.
And I'm Christine Phillips.
We are living through a polycrisis, a moment where cascading ecological, technological, social, political and economic pressures are reshaping the world in the latency of the present. Complexity is not an anomaly of our time, but its default setting. The challenge is not merely to decode it, but to engage with its temporalities, influence its exchanges, and anticipate reactions before they spiral beyond control. The future is not a thing you stumble into, but rather a continuous act. It is the unravelling of hacks that are coded, crafted, and built in the friction of the present. Design practice in this realm holds urgency as its condition. The next lines of code, what we nurture, control, or push back against will determine continuity or collapse. We are interested in the agency of critical design practice, the tools, stories, and strategies that we need to move forward from paralysis to possibility. How do we investigate the blind spots of our technologies, the narratives that shape them, and the speculative practices, architecture, fiction, and design, that help us inhabit the present more consciously? This isn't about imagining perfect futures or fearing catastrophic ones. It's about a grounded optimism. This is a design problem to assemble radical frameworks and possibilities, even when the dominant narrative is collapse. Because to speculate today is not an escape, it is a responsibility. To lead us through this domain, we are joined by Liam Young.
Liam Young is an Australian architect and designer, filmmaker, director, and BAFTA-nominated producer and visionary storyteller whose work explores the intersection of architecture, technology, and the future city. Operating between design, fiction, and critical foresight, he is the co-founder of the think tank Tomorrow's Thoughts Today and the nomadic research studio Unknown Fields Division. His film work is grounded in academic research conducted at institutions such as Princeton, MIT, and Cambridge, and he now leads the groundbreaking master's program in fiction and entertainment at SciArc in Los Angeles. He has authored and edited several books, including Machine Landscapes, Architectures of the Post-Anthropocene, and Planet City, which imagines a speculative designed to house the entire population of the Earth. We saw Liam last night at a marvellous live cinema event in Collingwood. And Liam, today, welcome to the Super Urban Podcast, and thanks for joining us in the studio on this early and crisp Melbourne morning. Okay, Liam, so perhaps we can begin with a conversation about your practice and how you got to where you are today. It's a movement from architecture to film and then much broader ideas about speculative fiction systems. And you've talked about how that brings you to a much bigger audience than you would otherwise. So perhaps you can talk about how you got to that position and maybe how that then circles back to the designers of cities today.
So I started way back in Brisbane at the University of Queensland. I'm sure a lot of listeners understand that program. It's a very traditional idea about what architecture is. It's domestic architecture, timber battens, touch the earth lightly kind of stuff. But in doing that program, I got a real grounding in the fundamentals of space. This was Colin Rowe, Gaston Bachelor, The Poetics of Space, what it means to Norberg Schultz and Genius Loci, and what it means to occupy place. But all of my heroes, the people I would read by torchlight under the covers, were Archigram and Super Studio and Archizoom, all of these visionary architects in the 60s and 70s. That was the kind of architecture that I was really interested in. And the moment I could, I left and went and worked for Zaha in London, thinking I was moving to the equivalent kind of practice that existed today. Zaha at the time hadn't won all the competitions. It wasn't the massive office that it is today. When I first started there were 20 people in the office, and she was still doing paintings, and she taught me how to paint and draw, crafting those iconic images of her early career. And while I was there, we won all those competitions, and Cincinnati was being built, and I worked on Wolfsburg Science Museum, one of her other early museum projects. And I very quickly came to the realization that what we thought of as the pinnacle of the profession, was really just a service industry for despots and dictators. This was a peak Starchitect moment. This was when the Dream Commission was the iconic building in the Middle East, the Dream Tower in China, penthouses and beach houses for rich people. And it seems like all of the interest in the revolution that I was seeing in those visionary architects of the 60s and 70s was totally diluted by architecture's relationship to capital, where being expensive practitioners were really only available to those with the power and means to afford us, at least at that experimental level. And I got rather sick of doing one more of those projects over and over and over again, especially in a moment when cities were radically being reimagined through technology, and the beginning of the smart city conversations, the beginnings of talk around AI governance and drones, driverless cars, the way that mobile technologies were changing cities, the shifting nature of public space from piazzas to platforms. And it seemed to me that the traditional remit of architecture, even in its most experimental and avant-garde form, was no longer equipped to engage with those forces of change. And as the Starchitect offices were being marginalized to boutique luxury practices. And there's certainly a space for that type of work in the same way that the world needs Louis Vuitton handbags. But if you really are interested in the forces that affect change in cities, one really needed to rethink what a practice looked like. And I left architecture, I haven't worked in an office since, and slowly began the migration towards film. But really I landed at film through speculation. These technologies that I talk about, I often describe them as before culture technologies, which is to say that they've arrived to us faster than our cultural capacity to understand what they might mean has. And therefore, any design practice that really wants to engage with them needs to be a speculative one, needs to get ahead of that technology transfer chain, needs to start to engage in those systems before they meet the road and before they're rolled out, which essentially means before they become profitable. And speculating on the implications of these technologies before they arrive became the most provocative and revolutionary form of practice that I could imagine. And when you talk about speculation, you talk about fictions. When you talk about fictions, you talk about storytelling. When you talk about storytelling, you end in film as a means to communicate and disseminate those stories to the most widest audiences possible. Because in many ways, we've always communicated and disseminated ideas through stories. And the medium of stories has changed from oral histories and traditions to books, sitting in front of the TV when we're growing up, watching cartoons. We're all literate in stories, and the most literacy around stories today is, certainly when I was shaping my practice, is film. Now you could probably argue that it's TikToks and 30-second clips, but still, like, I was interested in engaging with the mediums of popular culture as a way to disseminate what I think are critical architecture and urban ideas to the broadest audience as possible.
It's such an interesting description of the trajectory, particularly at the beginning when you used the classic Australian touch the earth lightly and sort of invoking Glenn Murcutt, and then you're able to connect that ecological thinking with Buckminster Fuller and that whole tradition. So it's a sort of sense that the promise of all that ecological thinking has never been fulfilled.
Yeah, well, despite
kind of need to re-speculate it.
Yeah, I mean, just despite shitting on the traditional nature of UQ, I really think I'm still practicing that form of architecture, right? I think my work is deeply about place, and always has been. I'm often described now as a world builder, and my practice as an artist, I argue, in my medium is worlds, not paintings or film, drawings, but worlds. But really, world building began as a practice because I was engaged and interested in place, especially in a moment where there's no such thing as a single place anymore. In a globalized world, everything is connected to everything. And even a single lonely vacant residential lot in Brisbane is caught up in a very tangled web that stretches across the entirety of the earth. And in a tiny little domestic practice, you're still engaged in these massive supply chains, and the choices you make are setting in motion reverberating effects that echo around the entirety of the earth. So truly, when you want to think about place today, you have to think about world. You have to think about planetary scale relationships. So it was an attempt to rethink what sight was. In the context of the tradition that I was taught in, that architecture should respond to sight. In this planetary moment, sight is a very complex thing. And the architectural vocabulary, even the architectural drawing set, falls apart when you start to talk about those planetary scale relationships. We don't really have the means of expression to deal with those relationships. Our best attempt is abstract diagramming, I guess, looking at material flows and things like that. But often, I talked about this last night, often the extent to which we engage in a problem is defined by the site drawing. And that site drawing is generally about dealing with, at best, like solar shade lines and adjacencies of scale, circulation paths, traffic maybe, but really we should be talking about material supply chains and the hole in the ground where the material you specify begins its life, or the forest that you enact when you design those timber batten shade structures on the outside of your Brisbane architecture. So what does it mean for an architect to deal with worlds? I still think that that's the project, and my answer to the inadequacies of the site plan is really to explore film and storytelling as a way to narrate those intricate connections and perhaps reveal the invisible relationships that exist between things. So I still think I'm fundamentally performing acts of architecture, even if I might do it from Hollywood. I would argue that I think all architects and designers, either at the scale of the product or the scale of the city, should be dealing with worlds and reimagining the drawing set that we have at our disposal to engage those planetary relationships, whether you call yourself a speculative architect or a world builder or not.
In terms of your relationship with the work, are you sort of interested in capturing, I guess, a sort of zeitgeist or a moment, or is it about trying to kind of stay ahead of the paradigm? Or how do you conceptualize your projects or your themes?
Yeah, but I think what's critical about the work that all of us should be doing is trying to identify the moment in which we're in. Right? Like, what is the most urgent and critical contribution someone can make? And that's always the question we ask when we're trying to figure out what the next project is. Often our work begins in what futurists would call a process of signal scanning, where you're just like sticking your head in the fire hose and listening to the conversations. My next big project is around AI and the physical infrastructures of AI, of course, because we have to be talking about this right now. When we did our research work around lithium, that began just after Elon Musk did his famous tech keynote, before he went bonkers, when he was being talked about in the same breath as Steve Jobs. This keynote he did announcing the Tesla Powerwall and the solar roof was proclaimed as the most visionary since Steve Jobs launched the iPhone. And he never talked about where the lithium came from. He just kind of discarded it and said, yeah, it's somewhere in Nevada. But in order to power that vision of the future, it basically would mean reimagining the global economy and seeing Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina as the new
Middle East
power magnet, the new Middle East, exactly. So we packed our bags and flew to Bolivia to see where the world's largest lithium reserve was, and to engage in that conversation. And all of our work kind of follows that trajectory. One of my early projects in The Robot Skies is a film about drone surveillance in London, and it began when I read a headline that for the first time civilian drones were outnumbering military drones in the air. This was the early days of DJI,
Right.
where you could walk down to a toy store and for a couple of $100 buy a 4K resolution camera drone, and in 15 minutes learn how to fly it like a pro in a park. And there were no regulations on doing it. You could fly it over an airport and cause billions of dollars in damage, and a kid could do it. So let's have that conversation.
Right.
So I think that's part of what we can do as architects. We're trained to synthesize complex ideas in a really unique way. We exist between culture and technology in a way that very few disciplines do. So we can bring those ideas together, and we can kind of sense the zeitgeist in a way that I think is really adept and powerful. And if we don't act on that extraordinary capacity to bring these worlds together, then I don't know what it is that we're doing. Again, there's probably great practices concerned with the designing of gorgeous trinkets and sculptural objects and luxury pieces for those that can afford it, and there's still that place in the world, but I really think we have this extraordinary capacity to affect change in cities, so if we're not doing that, what are we doing?
So, I mean, there is that accessibility to your work that I think we probably can't achieve in the production of a building in the conventional sense. Who do you think, I mean, what is your end goal with these projects in putting forward these speculations? Who is your audience? Who are you speaking to? And what are you hoping to achieve with your visions of speculations about cities and infrastructures?
I'm trying to speak to as many people as possible, really. That's one of the great tragedies, I think, of the architecture and design discipline, is that so many of us are content to just talk to our friends and colleagues. We make books for each other, we do lectures to each other, we do biennales for each other, and if we really value the ideas that we're putting out into the world, it's criminal and totally negligent that we aren't finding new ways to get those ideas out into the world. We exist in buildings like this. We're doing this conversation here in RMIT, where people might train for 7 years to learn the language of plans, sections, and architectural drawings. And it's a very privileged language, and very coded language. And to just convey your ideas through those mediums limits the audience of those that have had that kind of training. And I gravitated to film, and there's many other tactics and strategies that one could employ to do this, but I moved to film to try and find ways to be accessible, especially in a context where that word accessible is often leveled at architects, designers, artists, with derision. Right? Bjarke's so accessible. We turn our nose down because he happened to get on 60 Minutes or something, and through some form of jealousy and anger, because he also is an egotistical maniac, we throw away those kind of practices, or the accessible artist we dismiss as not being serious. But there's something extraordinary to be said for being generous with your ideas and finding ways to put them into the world. As many people as possible can grab them. And I think if I've had any success in the art world, it's been because my work takes really complex and challenging and provocative ideas around things like climate change or planetary infrastructure, and find ways to get a 17-year-old kid excited about it and connect to it. And again, that's why I'm in Los Angeles, is to co-opt that massive machine of popular culture, both the center of the world for video games, as well as film, as well as immersive experiences, virtual reality, and so on, and to kind of exist like a parasite in those infrastructures, or at the very least, like embed like Trojan horses, critical ideas in those worlds, so that when someone is spending 40, 50 hours inside a game world, they're also exploring a critical idea about the city and what the futures could be. So I really think that in many ways that's the project of our generation, especially when we have to try and get everyone on board with the radical changes that are about to happen and get people excited, engaged in that, trying to find ways to bring everyone along with us and to talk to both sides of the aisle, both the left and the right, to not use language that divides, but find language that brings us together around these themes and ideas. That's the project.
Như vậy có thể thấy rõ ràng khả năng là vô tận giống như những con đường luẩn quẩn trong một vùng lớn đi tuyệt vời.
In that break, you just heard some music from Vietnam, recently discovered by us, the group called Run Cup Doi. It's a 2023 collection of music called One, and that piece is beautifully titled The Virgin Mary in the Grilled Cheese.
I'm interested to hear more about your relationship with technology. I mean, you mentioned you're working with AI at the moment, and there feels like a bit of a tension in your work. A lot of your work has both the utopic, the dystopic, the pragmatic. You embrace technology, yet you also reveal some of the complexities that technology is bringing to us and to the interconnected relationships of our planet. For me, there's also a sense of reductiveness about technology at the moment, in the way, particularly with AI, where it seemed to be getting stuck in these sort of echo chambers, this data scraping of the same stuff that we are all drawing from. I mean, what is your relationship with technology at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes in the world of futures, we talk about aspirational and hopeful futures. They often look the same in that they've come out of a particular ideology of the 60s and 70s environmental movement that sees technology in opposition to the natural world, and that any kind of solution means some limiting of technology and its systems as they roll out across the world. And it's some zero-sum game where a win for technology means a loss for nature. And that ideology, ironically, went on to found Silicon Valley in the current tech movement as it stands. But it's also an ideology that focuses on the local, and it's why if you were to Google utopian cities now, your stream would be filled with the same kind of images of trees on rooftops and little kind of vertical farms in local neighborhoods, and some kind of retreat back to the natural. Kids running around in bare feet, chasing butterflies and flying kites and that kind of thing. Those bucolic images like define contemporary utopian thinking and ideology around cities, but there's no such thing as the local. iPad. What does that even look like? We've blown past those kinds of solutions. So in this really unique moment where we have no viable aspirational images of our future, they're all based on these failed ideals from boomer environmentalism, and the kind of scales of change that we require, planetary scaled action, planetary scaled carbon infrastructure, the massive rewiring of our energy infrastructure, and so on. Those big ideas in popular culture are typically the work of the Bond villain or the evil mega corporation. Planetary scale thinking is dystopian. The densification of our cities, density in popular culture is dirty and congested, not talked about in the way that the most vibrant cities on earth are the most dense. So we have this extraordinary lack of viable images. Never mind doing something about trying to get there. We don't have any shared narratives around what kind of futures we want, and no shared narratives about technology's role in those futures. So I might make a work like The Great Endeavour, which is a visualization of what will become humanity's largest ever construction project, the design of a planetary network of carbon removal infrastructure, as a means to try and give voice to that new planetary imaginary, this new image of a future that I think is both pragmatic and viable, but also hopeful and aspirational, because it involves this global collaboration to actually build it. Hopeful in the sense that if we can build it, we don't go extinct, at least not from carbon in the air. But we don't really talk about it, even though the scale of problem that it's meeting head on is gargantuan. We don't talk about it, even though it really is, as I describe, our generation's moon landing. And we need to kind of have those discussions around technology. Especially in the context where a lot of the narratives around those kind of infrastructures, especially from even the left, is really negative, because they have been misused. The biggest carbon removal schemes currently on Earth are run by the fossil fuel industry as a means to continue business as usual. And it's become this alibi to keep on burning fossil fuels, but to demonize the technology purely because of these particular use case scenarios really denies its potential to be used in a whole lot of other different ways. So I often talk about the roles of my practice as being that of science illustration or technology illustration. Like, I'm just taking critical ideas and rolling them out and visualizing what that might look like. Because in the end, I talk about this idea that climate change is no longer a technological problem. Like, we've had this extraordinary development across the last 20 years that suggests that everything we need to dig us out of the holes we've created for ourselves to meet the polycrisis head on is already here, and it's been here for a long time. It's proven and tested. Climate change is now not a crisis of technology, but a crisis of the imagination, a political problem, not a technological problem. And what that means is that the work of design, speculation, cultural production, when climate change is now a cultural project, becomes some of the critical work we should be doing.
A lot of your, I mean, there's obviously storytelling, which is so important in your work, but for me, your work has always been so akin to many of the great science fiction writers in the way that it deals with science, it deals with facts, but it also has a layer of speculation about the future. But as someone with a past as an architect, as someone who studied architecture, you bring that to life very much in a scenic visual way, which demands collaboration with many different people, from costume makers to Hollywood filmmakers. Can you speak about that role of collaboration in your work and the importance of that and what you get out of those collaborations?
Yeah, I mean, the designing of worlds is a large undertaking. It shouldn't be done on your own, really. And I was talking about this last night at this event where I was trying to put the kind of speculation we do up in contrast to the sorts of scales of mega proposals that typically architects author, still out of the model of the genius napkin sketch, the sole author that's figured out the problems and solved the ideas of the world, and here is my vision, come on, buy in, let's get the developers on board and do it. The kind of narratives that I put out there are provocations more so than solutions, because I don't think the world needs those types of solutions right now. They need kind of shared conversations to figure out even what kind of futures we all want to be living in. So I build these imaginaries, and I think part of what gives those imaginaries enough force for them to find traction is that they are immersive, but that they're also believable. And in the context of world making, what gives those worlds that sense of immersion is the detail and the rigor through which you go about doing it. So they're intensely collaborative processes when we develop these projects. They begin with relationships with scientists and technologists, political theorists, folklorists, community engagement, in indigenous communities, as well as science fiction authors and costume designers, to start to think about the implications of an idea that might be the seed of the world, the kind of what if question that begins that project and runs all the way through its scales, from the big mega planetary and urban scale questions all the way through to the idea about subcultures and what people wear and what a 17-year-old does on a Saturday night in these environments. Like, I think that's what gives it its weight when you start to think about it in all those forms. And again, to do that and to bring in all those different ideas requires the engagement with a whole range of different disciplines. And the more rigorous and intricate you are with your world building, I think the more immersive and compelling that world becomes. So, some of my key collaborators are musicians, and thinking about the soundtracks for worlds. I do lots of live performances, I call them live cinema events, where I take people through those worlds with live musicians and live scores, sometimes live dances on stage. I have great relationships with costume designers. The costumes for Planet City were developed with Anne Crabtree, who comes from the Hollywood world. She designed the costumes for Handmaid's Tale, that iconic red and white gown that's now become a symbol of protests around the world.
Yeah.
Was hers, as well as Westworld, season 1. And I often I talk about the idea of worlds being medium agnostic, which is to say that you can build this world and then you can extract from that world a graphic novel, a film, a VR experience, a book, performance, and so on. I often work with dancers, and we do performative work inside those environments, but it means that I can also invite people in to occupy those worlds. So amazing science fiction authors from all over the world, like Chen Fan, from amazing Chinese novelist. I think Chinese science fiction is the most interesting science fiction going around right now.
Right.
He's written a number of stories set in these worlds, and as well as Kim Stanley Robinson, the kind of the grandfather of climate fiction, has written stories inside Planet City, for example. So it becomes this really interesting environment where you can just invite people in and they can play around and find their own stories. And sometimes those stories conflict the narrative of the world and push back against it. Sometimes they are immersed within it. But it means that you're able to create work which is much bigger than any single practitioner. And in that way you can find different kinds of audiences all around the world, and you can be inclusive in a way that sometimes a more singular architecture project can't.
I think you also described perfectly the dilemma with traditional utopian cities through history, which is that they're incredibly abstract and lacking in detail, and therefore kind of exist nowhere. And kind of watching Planet City last night, I was thinking, where is this going to be, and when's it going to be? Because it feels like it is possible, and it's that intricacy of the detail that you were just describing.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Planet City is a work that began with the site. I mean, it had to, in order for us to do all the calculations that were necessary. Like, it's a real working model of a city. Like, on the cover of the book is how many heads of lettuce are required to feed the population of the city. Like, we did all those numbers. And, it's like asking that question, like, what would it mean to design a city that would extract no new resources in its construction? So we did a lot of analysis on, like, how you could reclaim fragments, material, ecosystems that have already been mined and remine our existing cities to build it. What would it mean to build a city where its footprint of production existed totally in parallel to, on top of its footprint of consumption? What would it mean to empower a city entirely from systems entirely within its own location? So it works. But, and very early conversations I talked about where it was, but that started to become the only thing that people wanted to talk about. Because then it started to read like a proposal.
It's the ultimate NIMBY project, isn't it?
Yeah. Why is it here? And where it was is actually a very provocative position, because I wanted to have this really challenging conversation about what we would be willing to sacrifice in order to do this. And people would be reading it as a proposal. And I try and argue that although the works can act as a blueprint in some form, Planet City itself is not any kind of top-down solution. I haven't figured it out and, like, here's the answer, and putting it in front of people, and we pack our bags and next Tuesday we're going to meet out there. But instead, it's to say, look, we can really get this working at this crazy scale. Why are we hung up about the possibilities of reimagining a city like Melbourne or London or Sandton? If we can do this crazy thing, it's nothing to imagine how we might rewire Melbourne so it's entirely running on renewables, or doesn't kind of recycles all of its waste, like it's
or feeds itself.
Feeds itself. It's so simple to imagine. We're not waiting for some tech billionaire to figure it out for us, or to crack some fusion technology that's going to make it happen, or for an alien tesseract cube to land through which we can power this future. We can do it. We can do it tomorrow. It's political will, it's cultural bias that's standing in our way, which are things that are pretty immobile right now, but are things that also you can imagine change. So stating where the city was, I thought, changed the conversation in a way that wasn't productive and became more valuable to think about the city in the same way we think about Atlantis or El Dorado as kind of a mythic city that could be everywhere and anywhere, because it kind of could be if you just twiddle the numbers a bit. But really, it's a provocation to say, like, why, to help us to see our own cities in new ways.
Yeah, I think, that was something really interesting about it, in that I think everyone recognises something in it that they're familiar with, and you can use that as a way to sort of latch onto it as well. But I was also thinking about it in the context of, I guess, an emerging field of thinking, and people like Timothy Morton or Saskia Southon and Kelly Easterling and Benjamin Bratton and even yourself, around this idea of that the scale of the city is no longer, I guess, an object, or the traditional city is not an object of design anymore, and it's basically recognizing it within much larger systems. And I'm curious, in this instance, is the kind of, I guess, the nomenclature or the sort of terminology of the city itself, up for grabs, or is it a redundant type to consider?
That's an interesting question. Yeah.
I always do these lecture performances, these storytelling performances. An early one was called City Everywhere, and Planet City comes out of that work. But when I talk about Planet City, I often run our existing planetary scaled city against it in parallel and talk about two cities the size of the planet. One is entirely speculative and the other is already here, kind of hiding in plain sight, as a means to narrate this idea that we all exist in a planetary scale city, in that we have urbanized the entirety of the Earth, and a landscape that seems seemingly empty is in some form either a product of the city or produces the city. And we have terraformed the planet from the scale of the cell to the tectonic plate. There is no not city. So therefore, you like to think about a city, you're really thinking about the planet. And another line from my performances, I begin a lot of them with this phrase, the city is a fiction. Because when we think about something like Melbourne or Los Angeles, is as a story. Because like physically, you can't really define its edges, especially in this planetary context. There is no edge to the city. There is no center to the city. It is everywhere and ubiquitous. So therefore, cities are shared narratives. You know, Melbourne and its definition is whatever the community of Melbourne decide it is in many ways. I mean, it has various policy and regulatory implications and implications around governance, but they don't really relate to anything physical or tangible anymore. They're just strange lines we once drew on a map. So the city is only useful as a phrase in those terms to understand communities and shared narratives, because it's not productive to think about it systemically, because the problems of a city, again, are solved at planetary scales, not at scales of the city. You can't think in those kind of borders. Climate change is a problem that doesn't exist at the scale of the city-state or even the nation-state. And its solutions require extraordinary collaboration. And what we've seen in the literal failure to do anything meaningful about climate change is a failure of the nation-state or the city-state, because those forms of governance just aren't equipped to deal with the scale of global collaboration and the forms of collaboration that are necessary to do it. So we radically need, there's an urgency to reimagine these systems of governance to deal with these projects head on. Part of the research we're doing around this new work, around the physical infrastructures of AI, is looking at moments in our history where we have acted collectively, where we haven't acted on the basis of the particular politics of a city or nation, when we have come together. You know, like at some point we all got together and decided that a shipping container would be this big, you know, and that has created the world that we live in, right? That consensus. At a certain point, when we realized that there was a massive hole in the ozone layer and we realized what was causing it, we got together in a meeting and we stopped the production of chlorofluorocarbons. We just did it, you know. And when we talk about the end of fossil fuels, we talk about this problem that seems so impossible, yet we have in our lifetimes got together and just said enough and stopped. We got together and joined oceans with a canal. We've done big and extraordinary things in our history, and we need to do those things again. But those things don't occur when we start to think about the biases and the particular interests of a city, for instance, in its current form. And it's a great tragedy that the rise of the America First movement has led to a new valuing of nationhood, as the rise of the right has used that as a means to literally reverse any attempts we've made towards tackling climate change. So not only is it a set of terminologies or scales of thinking that's no longer fit for purpose, it's actually really dangerous to be thinking in those terms and to be thinking about the city as a city.
I mean, there's that sort of reframing, or even just the framing of the climate crisis in planet cities, really compelling, because as you describe it, cuts across any political notion. I mean, you could say it's profoundly conservative in the sense that it wants to conserve something. I think there's there's a great line there about the future city dances in the skins of its past, something like that. So it sort of seems to just get over that conversation about, who's going to run this job.
Yeah, but it's very, I think you're pointing to certain practitioners that are making this claim for the planetary, and the planetary has become very much a buzzword now.
Yeah.
But it also sits in contrast to a lot of what most of the discipline is doing, like Koolhaas's countryside exhibition, for instance, was one of the most recent, big projects on the city. He claims that he's been looking at the city for a long time, and now he's looking elsewhere. But to define the countryside in opposition to the city still privileges the city as the thing that exists.
So very European. I think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I still think it's a certain way of thinking that's locked into a particular kind of 90s ideology around what urbanism is, because there is no city and countryside anymore. Like, you can't think about one without the other. One is literally the productive landscapes that produces the other. It's just one kind of interlinked, globulous form that's been spread across the entire planet. And Bratton and I talk about these ways of conceiving and thinking about the city, and he talks about the necessary Copernican turn that is required, and he charts this course of the conceptualization of the planet from the Earthrise image. When we see this blue marble for the first time, and we have a particular understanding about the planet on which we're in and its fragility. But really, he then contrasts that with the contemporary image of the Earth, which he talks about being the Earth as an instrument, and he puts the Earthrise image against the first imaging of the black hole. It was only possible through a network of planetary telescopes that could create a lens literally the size of the Earth in order to see that black hole at sufficient resolution. And that's the journey that we've gone on. This precious, untouched, fragile blue marble to the Earth as an object of technology that's been engineered across its entire surface. And that's the world that we live in. And that's the city that we all occupy. And that's a city that we need to be designing for and finding ways to map and contextualize. And again, I think that's what so many of my projects are trying to talk about. I often talk about my work recently as being the visualization of new planetary imaginaries, which is like attempts to look at other ways to think about the planet beyond, Bucky's spaceship Earth, beyond the 60s and 70s ecological movement that sees the Earth as this kind of natural and untouched thing, and find ways to bring people into those stories and share those journeys.
Yeah, because the paradox is that once you can see the whole planet as engineered, then you're willing to embrace, for example, the idea of agriculture not as a pseudo-natural activity, but something that you need to consolidate in order to free up actual,
Exactly,
wilderness.
but that's also still really provocative. Like, a lot of people look at Planet City and I would never want to live there. And they live in a house on Cottesloe Beach, and they have a backyard and a front yard and two bits down the side where they keep their bins, and a cat and a dog and a 4-car garage. and like, why would they want to move to Planet City? They're living pretty, and they see the vertical farms of Planet City. They're like, I could never eat food like that. Meanwhile, the food they're eating is like the days when agriculture and food production was natural, long since blown past. It already is this planetary scale industry. So we put forward those kinds of images of vertical farms. We travel to the world's tallest vertical farm in Dubai, which is run by Emirates Airlines. Essentially, if you've eaten food on an Emirates flight, it's come from this vertical farm. They used to ship all their food in. They would make all the business class meals in the world's largest kitchen, which is in Dubai. They used to just bring it all in. Now they grow their own lettuce inside that vertical farm to feed the business class population of the world. And the hotspot for vertical farming is New Jersey right now. The world's most organic strawberry is grown in a warehouse in New Jersey. And we think about that notion of organic food in a totally different way when we close our eyes and think about where that strawberry should be grown. To get that certificate, it's grown on a bit of land that's been passed down through generations, under sun, but instead it's grown with very little water resources, no pesticides because it's essentially grown in a closed room environment.
Right.
With targeted light from blue and red LEDs. And that is the most quote unquote natural strawberry on earth. So trying to introduce people to the idea that where we grow our food isn't from rolling green pastures and black and white cows and sitting in the shade under trees, but is instead growing in purple LED light in neighborhood vertical farms, because that's really the only way to feed 8 billion people in a way that doesn't set the world on fire. So trying to break down those assumptions about what our futures are supposed to look like. It's not going to be green, it's going to be purple. And that's really challenging, and that's why a lot of the work is provocative or challenging, because it runs against those ideals of what we think futures could be. And that's why it's also challenging for the left as well, because so many extraordinary people have devoted their lives to that idea of ecology that comes out of that movement. And it's an extraordinary tragedy to acknowledge that it didn't work and we didn't listen when we had a chance. And admitting that kind of failure is hard. So a lot of the resistance to these kind of narratives comes from the left as well. But there's no time to quibble over left and right, one side or the other. We need to find ways that we can move forward and share narratives. So the attempt is to try and introduce those images in a way that they feel compelling, they don't feel alienating, to bring people with us on those
I think it's really kind of interesting how much your practice and your work, relies on or deals with the cultural problem, and I think it surfaces in, just thinking again in relation to where the city can't see, and how much of that is about, how do we seed a counterculture? Like, there's a different take on sort of technoculture there, and perhaps even your publication Machine Landscapes, where it's again a really kind of strong recognition about, and especially for the architecture discipline, that so much of what we've been trained to do is design buildings, cities and spaces for immediate sort of interactions with people, and now there are warehouses and autonomous plants and factories and stuff that might not see a single human being in them. And how does this sort of change or challenge what we do as designers?
I've always thought of our work as being engaged with the subcultural implications of technology. William Gibson, the iconic science fiction author, the origins of cyberpunk and Neuromancer, his novel is where the word virtual reality first appears. He talks about this idea that the street finds its own uses for things when talking through technology. And that's kind of where we get interested in the technology we might be engaging with a particular world or narrative, is like when that technology becomes democratized in some form, then you see its real potential. So Where the City Can't See is a film shot entirely through the same mapping systems that driverless cars use to understand the world. So it's one of the first narrative films made entirely with LiDAR scanners, and it's trying to capture the story of a group of teenagers on one night essentially going to a dance party. And in a city that sees everything with millimeter precision, where are the spaces of exception? We used to go to raves on the periphery of cities in industrial areas because you could turn the music up, people wouldn't complain, the police wouldn't kind of bother you and come round, you could do drugs, have sex, dance, listen to music. But in this city of ubiquitous surveillance filled with drones and driverless cars, where are those spaces? And the argument was that they exist in the gaps between how machines see. LiDAR is based on line of sight. It's based on a laser hitting a surface and reflecting back to a sensor. So if you can mess with how that laser reflects, you can kind of create a distortion or a glitch or a disturbance or a shadow in the data set. So we designed these LiDAR camouflage costumes. We developed a series of dance movements that would distort the body, so it would disappear from gait recognition algorithms, and exploring the ways that these spaces of exception might exist in plain sight, or exist, to our human eyes in the most exuberant way, but to the eyes of the machines that our cities are being organized around, they might start to disappear. But it was all coming from this idea of what does rave culture look like in the smart city? What does a goth drone look like? We're interested in asking those kind of questions because so often technology is framed through the lens of early adopters and the sorts of people that line up outside the Apple store for the next iPhone. And similarly, if you're interested in the cultural implications of technology, you have to acknowledge that a lot of these technologies aren't made for us. The cultures they're engaging with are cultures of other machines and ecologies of other kinds of systems.
Of course.
And so often as architects, especially, again, my background at UQ was through the lens of the poetics of space and the cellar and the attic and what it means to exist poetically in a room and to see the light move across the floor and onto the wall. But whereas in many ways the dominant typologies of our age are not occupied by people at all, that language of architecture, that vocabulary breaks down. I argue that the most critical buildings today are data centers and filled with human exclusion zones, are these vertical farms where humans are literal contaminants in the system. What does it mean to design those spaces? That data center is literally the repository of all of our knowledge. Everything about who we are contained in this thing, but there isn't a star architect in sight designing these things. It's this conglomeration of commercial practices around the world, and there's no real typology they have to draw on. There's an amazing building in San Francisco called the Internet Repository, like the Internet Archive, which is where we were storing the internet. And through various quirks of Bay Area planning regulations, they managed to get access to a church. And they built that archive in a church. And they wanted people to be able to come to it. So they lined that church with sound-absorbed material because the internet is noisy. If you've ever been inside a data center, it's loud. It's like hundreds and thousands of computer cooling fans going at full speed. And they wanted the internet to be a place where people could sit and talk. So they had to kind of essentially dull the noise of all of the server fans. And that's really interesting, I thought, to think about these infrastructures as being human in some way. Do we want the internet to be a place where we can walk and talk and sit? Or should it be shut off in a concrete bunker somewhere where no one has access to, kind of hidden, buried in a mountain? Should it be this glorious sculptural object in the middle of a city? We're not having those conversations, but again, these are the cornerstones of contemporary culture. What does it mean to think about a vertical farm as a space we might picnic in, as well as grow strawberries? I often talk about there's narratives inside Planet City of people going on hikes through the vertical farms in the same way that we wander through a forest. What would that start to look like? How can we rethink these places of production that currently keep us out? Do we want to go in? Is that even something we should be thinking about? Maybe we should just leave them alone, to just be their own ecologies and to do their own things. But what it suggests is that at the very least the language of architecture needs to be reimagined. I often think I'm too far removed from architecture and engage in this project myself, but I imagine a new metric handbook or a new Neufitz for the machine world that starts to look at materials not on the basis of how they transmit light, but how they transmit Wi-Fi signal.
Yes.
What does it mean to think about curvature and radii of curves on the basis of LiDAR laser reflection? What does it mean to reimagine the street level of a city in such a way that a driverless car can more readily and easily navigate, or a drone that uses LiDAR as its sole way of seeing? Zaha Hadid curvy building becomes the exact opposite of what you want, to try and compute that curvature as a driverless car is careening down the road at 60 kilometers an hour.
Yes.
What does it mean to start to think about material reflectivity in those terms? What does it mean to think about parking garages based on those systems? What does it mean to think about shared zones and traffic zones and footpaths and lanes when cars are now going to be designed and organized based on algorithms that maybe means that if a kid runs out and they start playing a game of football on the road, cars just automatically reroute around them. And parents don't have to worry about their kids playing in traffic anymore. So it suggests that like a total reevaluation of what we do as architects and the criteria through which we judge a lot of the choices we're making as designers makes us rethink what a client is. That's purely on the basis of technology, but you could also imagine rethinking those same systems on the basis of ecology. I often talk about the idea of human-centered design, which we, in architecture conferences by the Institute and so on, we herald as being exactly what we should be doing, which human-centered design generally looks like, cafes spilling out on the sidewalks and tree-lined streets and things like that. But it's also an alibi for organizing the entirety of the earth based on our own desires. What if we talk about atmospheric-centered design, or wetland-centered design, or whooping crane-centered design? What does it mean to shift the nature of a client from a human to a hard drive or a wetlands ecosystem? So it suggests that the very vocabulary of architecture breaks down when you start to deal with that. So Australia's obsession with the poetics of space and phenomenology, I think is very much limiting in the context of the things we need to be doing, the conversations we need to be having.
Speaking of limiting, much as I'd love to keep this conversation going today, it's really fascinating. Thank you very much, Liam. But I think we need to get you to your next meeting.
Yeah, thanks for chatting. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Liam.
Awesome.
Right.
Right.
Liam, thank you for joining us on the Super Urban podcast and for navigating this terrain with such urgency, imagination, and clarity. As we've explored across your work, speculative design is a necessary form of critical and cultural literacy. This conversation has moved across architecture of code, climate, and complexity, tracing a practice that insists on design not as prediction, but as proposition. What's been mapped out here is a mode of working that navigates speculative storytelling, systems thinking, and critical design as active tools for engaging in the present. Tools not for escapism, but for confrontation, translation, and construction. The idea that the future is something we shape, not something that simply arrives, underscores the urgency of practice today. Design propositions, provocations, and speculations become a method of inhabiting complexity, of surfacing the infrastructures that govern us, and of assembling new ones, not to offer perfect futures, but to render possible ones unthinkable. This is the challenge and the responsibility. Thanks again, Liam, and of course to all our listeners for joining in. You're hearing us thanks to the generous support of the Alistair Swain Foundation and the RMIT University School of Architecture and Urban Design. We would like to acknowledge the people of the Bunwurrung and Woiwurrung language groups on whose unceded country we are recording this podcast, and extend that acknowledgement to all First Peoples of Australia who have been caring for the many layers of country for over 60,000 years.